Leave it to philosophers to challenge convention, even when it comes to relationship and marriage. In the middle 1700s, Voltaire carried on a 15-year relationship with the married Amélie de Châtelet, who also maintained relationships with other men. In the 20th century, existentialist philosophers Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir carried on an open relationship, leaving each party free to see other people. The same with Bertrand Russell and his wife Dora Black. And in recent years, philosophers Agnes Callard and Carrie Jenkins have written about their respective unconventional arrangements, Callard living with her husband and ex-husband, and Jenkins having more than one romantic partner. Well, we can add two other names to that list of philosophers whose love lives were unconventional: John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, two 19th century writers who advocated for personal liberty in private matters and against women's subjugation. Mill, of course, is most famous for his book On Liberty, which he almost certainly collaborated highly with Harriet on. But for almost 20 years, these two carried on a passionate relationship despite Harriet being married with two children. So let's take a look at this romance and see what it tells us about these two great minds, as well as the nature of love and marriage. Here's the story in brief. John Stuart Mill met Harriet Taylor in 1830 at a dinner party set up by a mutual friend. The two both wrote for the same radical magazine, the Westminster Review, and they shared common intellectual interests like secularism and women's rights. The two must have spent all evening together because several attendees gossiped about it in letters. One friend uncharitably suggested that Harriet Taylor, with a taste for coquetry, took possession of Mill and wrapped him up in a cocoon. Soon after, the two seemed to have fallen in love, and there's indication that Harriet actually tried to stop it before it went too far, but a single pleading letter from Mill persuaded her to continue the romance. Why did she try to stop it? Because by the time they met, Harriet Taylor had already been married for 4 years and had 2 children with John Taylor, a druggist who shared many of Harriet's radical views but was not by any account an intellectual. Their marriage might have been arranged, we don't know, but the Taylors seem to have been in love during the first years of their lives. No one knows for sure why that changed. There are some theories, and we'll get to them later. But by the time Harriet met John Stuart Mill, her marriage to John Taylor seemed strictly a marriage of convenience. While John Taylor may have been hurt by Harriet's love for another man, we don't really know what he thought. He allowed it, however, grudgingly. Mr. Taylor even allowed Mill to see Harriet at the house while he would go elsewhere. In 1833, they decided to live separately for a while, and after a last-ditch effort to live together again, they ultimately agreed to continue living separately. As F.A. Hayek notes, the understanding seems to have been that while Mr. Taylor agreed to the continuance of the friendship, the external appearance of married life should be preserved. As radical as the Taylors were, social and moral pressures of the day were enough that they needed to keep up at least the appearance of marriage. At this point, it seems that Mill fantasized that he and Harriet could become a truly monogamous couple, even writing to a friend that there will never again, I believe, be any obstacle to our being together entirely from the slightest doubt that the experiment would succeed with respect to ourselves, not as she used to say for a short time, but for our natural lives. Just a quick note, we might want to reflect on the reference to their relationship as the experiment. Despite Mill's hope, however, Harriet was at very least conflicted. In a way, she still loved John Taylor and the family she created with him. While marriage laws in England at the time granted Harriet no authority to end her marriage, she didn't really seem to want to, even despite her love for Mill. She wrote back to Mill that divorce would mean that I should spoil 4 lives and injure others. That is the only hesitation. She remained married, and they remained a ménage à trois. Mill continued to live at his family home, and Taylor at a house where she raised her daughter while John Taylor raised their sons. Harriet and John Mill saw each other frequently, but decided that their already scandalous affair would be all the juicier if they tried to live together. Because of the gossip, Mill and Taylor even lost quite a few friends and avoided the public spotlight as much as they possibly could. Mill and Taylor were not only romantic, but intellectual companions. Mill always seeing Taylor as his intellectual equal, if not his superior. For her part, Taylor had quite the intellect, which might be one reason her marriage with her druggist husband ultimately did not fulfill. Both always ran ideas by each other, praising and criticizing when necessary. Especially as a female in the mid-1800s, Taylor must have been frustrated not having the same intellectual outlet as a man would. So intellectually engaging with and influencing the ideas of Mill must have been really gratifying. For Mill, Taylor provided ample encouragement to help grow his confidence. When Mill, and probably Taylor, wrote the book Principles of Political Economy, Mill wanted to dedicate his book to Mrs. Taylor. Harriet, though, wanted to consult her husband before receiving such a public declaration. John Taylor warned against the dedication, suggesting that it is not only a few common people who will make vulgar remarks, but it is all who know any of us, and that the dedication will create talk that cannot but be extremely unpleasant to me. Not wanting to create a scandal, Mill did not dedicate the book to his unnamed co-author or lover. In 1848, John Taylor wrote to Harriet about his declining health, what would later be diagnosed as rectal cancer. Traveling with Mill at the time, she traveled home to dutifully take care of her husband, all while continuing to write to her lover. When John Taylor succumbed to cancer only months later, she and Mill waited 2 years before finally becoming husband and wife. All of this caused a scandal amongst Mill's family, who the couple subsequently broke from. The couple that had been in love but unmarried for over 20 years were now both in ill health and spent just 7 years as husband and wife before Harriet died. An obvious question arises. How intimate was the couple during the years of Harriet's marriage? Since they burned the mushier parts of their correspondence, we can't really say for sure. But there's some reason to believe that what they both said was true, that the couple did not, shall we say, hit the home run, though there's some evidence that they ran some of the bases. In The Voice of Harriet Taylor Mill, Joe L. M. Jacobs argues that it's actually quite possible that Harriet contracted syphilis from John Taylor, and this might explain the sudden break in romance between husband and wife, as well as why John was so allowing of Harriet to love another man. There's also some speculation that John Stuart Mill didn't seem all that interested in sex, that this was all based on gossipy impressions from friends. Either way, scholars generally agree that while these two had an unconventional relationship, coitus was probably not involved. Unconventionality of the relationship also matches the unconventional values of the players involved. Mill and Taylor first bonded over the issue of equality of the sexes, and this extended to critiquing the institution of marriage. Early in their relationship, they exchanged essays on their respective thoughts about marriage, and both were sharply critical of the institution and advocated for what we would today call no-fault divorce. Both parties should have rights and be able to leave an unsatisfying marriage. Taylor's essay contains the following thought. Be married, she said, is the object of women's existence, and the object being gained, they really do cease to exist as to anything worth calling life or a useful purpose. One observes very few marriages where there's any real sympathy or enjoyment of companionship between the two parties. She could very well have been talking about her unsatisfying marriage to John Taylor. Mill and Harriet both collaborated on Mill's most famous work, On Liberty, published after Harriet's death. There, Mill, and by extension Taylor, championed the individual's right to dissent from convention in idea and action. Most famously, the two defend the right to engage in what they call experiments in living. And recall that in a letter to a friend, Mill did refer to his relationship with Taylor as the experiment. So long as all affected parties consent and no one is harmed, society should not only tolerate, but embrace unconventional ways of life, for they give us glimpses of what is possible. The couple, however, was only able to live this conviction part of the way. The cultural sanctions against divorce and extramarital relations were at the time so strong that Mill and the Taylors were forced to put on some appearances. Since ethical non-monogamy is a hot topic right now, it might also be natural to ask if the relationship between Mill and the two Taylors qualifies. I would say yes and no. If we mean a relationship where parties have more than one romantic partner, this menage a trois wasn't that. In the modern day, John and Harriet Taylor would probably have gotten a divorce and co-parented, but in their time that just wasn't an option. The Taylors did love each other, but not in a romantic way. In other words, Mill and Taylor were romantically monogamous, but Harriet did have conflicted affections, and she was technically married to one man while in a relationship with another. So in that sense, we could call their relationship on the margins of ethical non-monogamy. Mill will forever be known as a champion of liberty against conformity and of equal rights between the sexes. Taylor, his beloved intellectual and romantic companion, was right there with him, even though she never got full credit for it. It makes sense then that these two could look past the conventions of their day, that they allowed love and happiness to flourish against all the existing marital conventions. This was really, truly a love ahead of its time.